His lecture for us tonight is entitled The Penn Museum, Glazed, Luohan in Context, Chinese Buddhist Art During the 10th to 12th Centuries. So please join me in welcoming him to the museum.
Thank you, Brian. I was wondering whether to use two mics and do this in stereo, but I may walk around. So it's very nice to be here. I'm trying to find a position which involves me looking at the screen, looking at you, and not falling off the stage. The Luohan at the Pennsylvania Museum is one of the great objects in Philadelphia, but like many objects in the Rotunda in the Pennsylvania Museum, this is known to a small number of people. So I want to try and illuminate it this evening, say some good things about the Penn Museum in general, and to start off, perhaps by thanking the director, Richard Hodges, who I overlapped with at the University of East Anglia for a brief while, Brian Rose, deputy director, Victor Mayer for the wonderful work that he did on the Silk Road exhibition. And this started off as a Silk Road lecture, but with the change of the lecture schedule around the Silk Road show, I was given the opportunity to talk about something other than the Silk Road. So we've moved off the Silk Road. We're actually on another road. We'll see which road we travel down. I'd also like to thank Stephen Lang of the Asian collections here at the museum, and my own assistant Laura Lowe, who did sterling work with technology that I can't even begin to understand. So let me, if I can work this. This is the museum, thank you. This is the museum's Luohan. A Luohan is a figure in Buddhist art which is most akin to a saint, say in Catholicism. The Buddha had two celebrated historical disciples, Ananda and Kasyapa, and over the course of centuries in the development of Mahayana Buddhism, the so-called Great Vehicle Buddhism, which is common in China, Japan, Korea, the Luohan expanded first to 16, then to 18, then to 100, then to 500. So we'll talk about that as we go along, but I wanted to explain very briefly what our Luohan was. I'm not actually going to do a great exposition on what Buddhism is, because that's another lecture. So some things I'll try and bring you along with as we proceed. The Penn Museum Luohan came in 1916, and it's one of a set, a remarkable set, and the reason I've chosen it is because that set is one of the most important groups of ceramic sculpture in the world. When I think about the relevant status of this set, and I speak now as somebody who's looked after a lot of different collections from different cultures, there aren't many ceramic groups that I can think of that rival this in terms of majesty and importance. I think of J.J. Candler's mice and models, and the great animal models, and I think of the Della Robbia workshops in Florence. But these are truly extraordinary. There are 9 known examples. There's a 10th which may be part of the group, and 3 are known to have been, of course, believed to be broken. So I'll talk a little bit later on about how many there might have been. This is the Luohan before it was cleaned, and I'm very glad the Penn Museum did clean it, because it does look much better cleaned, I have to admit. And I read through the conservation notes for the museum, and one of the remarks, which I found completely charming, was that the first layer of grime came off quite easily, because it was clearly from the candles and the cigarette smoke, from decades of pleasure in the Rotunda. So let's start putting it into context. And to put in context, you know, as art historians, we always play this trick. We say we're going to talk about the 10th and 13th centuries, and then we start in the 5th century BC. So go backwards. These are 2 objects in the Barnes collection, and I want to introduce this by talking about taste and the changes of taste, and about why we think images are alive in different ways. Now, Barnes first encountered Chinese sculpture in this building, and he visited the Penn Museum only 3 years after he started collecting art. And he visited in the company of George Byron Gordon, who was the then director, an archaeologist. And George Gordon had purchased many works of art from C.T. Lu, who was one of the great dealers in Chinese art. It wasn't always as salubrious a business as it is now. The art market, of course, is much tidier. The buying Chinese antiquities in the early part of the 20th century was as murky as it is now, I can assure you. But Barnes, he said when he visited the first time that he regarded a life-size glazed pottery-seated Luohan in the museum's collection as a powerful piece of work. So this figure that we're talking about today was something that was known to Barnes early in his collection career, and he liked it. Sometime later, in 1924, he acquired 3 heads from the north-central Chinese cave temple site at Tianlongshan. And these are 2 of them. One is from the late 6th century, about 570 on the left. It's a guardian figure, and the one on the right is a bodhisattva. So that's the name. What is a bodhisattva? We'll encounter those a little bit. A bodhisattva is another saintly figure in the Buddhist canon. The bodhisattva is an individual who has qualified for nirvana, but chooses, through their deep compassion for the plight of all living beings, to stay within the sentient realm and not disappear into the beyond. So the bodhisattvas are there to help us all and guide us to salvation. And this is a figure from about 710. And you won't find it now if you come to the Barnes, and the last few weeks were open, but because it normally lives on the 2nd floor in a case, along with another one. Now, when Barnes bought this, he had this terrific idea. He liked these so much, and he'd read a review of the Tianlongshan sculptures in a French journal, and he was going to write an article on them for an American journal saying how good they were, and he wrote to his dealer, Paul Guillaume, and said, can you send me photographs of these figures in the caves before they had their heads knocked off? Because I'd like to do this journal article showing them with their heads off and then in the caves. I think that would tell a really interesting story. And Guillaume wrote back and said, I don't think that's a very good idea. So he didn't. But it shows that Barnes himself had an interesting, and as we know, a Catholic view on art. But it wasn't a view his understanding of these heads was not the same as those for which they were commissioned originally, and that's the story that I want to explore a bit today. Now, roughly at the same time that the Penn Museum acquired its glazed Luohan, these figures were published in the Burlington magazine in London. I think this is the Buddhist police lineup. I have to say, Brian reminds me that after this talk is over, I'll try and make it not too late. I mean, I think we all ought to be able to go to bed this evening. That I will go up into the Rotunda and we can continue, those of you who want can continue chatting around the Luohan. You would normally be able to go up and see these 2 figures upstairs, because together with this one, they form part of the great Trinity, which was acquired by the Penn Museum in 1916. And they're absolutely stupendous. And this one is in Australia. And part of my talk this evening actually derives from a little paper I wrote in '97 about this figure. I had a bit of an argument with a colleague of mine in Australia, very unusually. There were 2 of us involved in running museums who were both interested in Chinese sculpture, specialists in Chinese sculpture. And we were discussing whether the 2 figures from the National Gallery, this one and its twin, were genuine or not. And I argued that they were, and this one might have been recarved in the medieval period. And so we went there and back. But it made me think about these wonderful figures in the Penn Museum. And if you're quick and you rush down to the Freer Gallery now, you can see them looking much better, I have to say, than they look upstairs. So, inspired by, I think Penn has been enormously generous in lending them, plus the one we just saw, plus several other figures. There's a wonderful show on these cave temples, but they do look rather glamorous, well lit. Now these figures from Xiangtanshan will play a part in the Luohan story, I think, later on. But they're absolutely monumental, and it was the beginning of Penn's aggregate of one of the finest collections of Chinese Buddhist sculpture in the world. And the display in the Rotunda, when these come back, is much better in terms of representing Chinese sculpture than you'll see in the Palace Museum in Beijing, for example. It's only really the Met with the Astor Hall that can rival the Penn Museum in grandeur for Chinese sculpture. And so I add it always to my hidden treasures of Philadelphia. So coming back to barns and people around barns and taste, and the acquisition of objects like this. So this little paper I wrote in '97 was about under what conditions or why people bought work like this at the time. And a colleague from Duke University has come up today, Stan Abe, who also writes on this. So if there are any questions at the end that I can't or won't answer, I'm going to throw them over to him. But he's also interested in this, that why people were so fascinated by Chinese sculpture in the early 20th century and what they were engaged in. Now, these are two nice images. One's rather large, actually. The one on the left is in the Met, it's almost a meter high. These are images of the Maitreya Buddha, altarpieces. The one on the right is, again, upstairs. It's dated 524 and 534. They are superb examples of bronze casting, but they were regarded canonically wonderful by modernist collectors and critics like Barnes. And the reason that they were regarded as so fantastic is that they were deemed to be marvelous because of the rhythms in the robes and the sort of play, the dynamic play of the form. And that's a key to the collecting, but Barnes' collecting and the collecting of others in the early 20th century. So I just want to talk about that for a moment. Here's the former keeper, I say the former keeper, he's been dead for about half a century. Here's the then keeper of antiquities, Asian antiquities at the British Museum, Lawrence Binion, also a great war poet. And he says, in terms of this sort of art, says, what's meant by the idea of colour and the idea of form? The phrases have no meaning, except insofar as the idea of harmony or rhythm underlies both. And then he goes on to talk about early Chinese aesthetic theory. And he says, in this theory, it's rhythm that holds a paramount place, not be it observed imitation of nature or fidelity to nature, which the general instinct of the Western races makes the root concern of art. So what you find in these early ideas is, first of all, rhythm and harmony is paramount, and we hear that all the time at the Barnes, in the Barnes methodology of teaching. And secondly, we're still in that phase where different races have different innate ways of looking at the world. So the Chinese are going to have an innate way of understanding rhythm, and the Western races have a different way of understanding form, which is fidelity to nature. I think we moved on from that, but it's characteristic of the pre-First World War in the 1920s. And then the great writer on Chinese sculpture, Oswald Søren, who's Swedish, wrote, "Rhythm is the pulse beat in a work of art. It throbs," I love this, "it throbs, not with the regularity of the physical pulse. It transmits the vibrations of the inner man. The more intensely we feel the rhythm in a work of art, the more our aesthetic enjoyment is stimulated." And that was from Chinese sculpture in 1925, the year after Barnes bought his sculptures. And then Barnes himself, where he writes on, and this is not on Chinese art, but he's writing in the context of African sculpture, a couple of years after Søren wrote that piece on Chinese sculpture. He wrote, the repetition of similar lines, planes, and masses gives an effect of rhythmic sequence, as of beats in music, which satisfies the instinctive craving for rhythm which all human beings possess innately. When a characteristic rhythm pervades the various parts of an object, we feel an harmonious unity, and this satisfies another universal natural desire, that of order and equilibrium, which I like. I mean, I think that's good. It captures very much the aesthetic of the time, and you can just look at these objects and understand what they're talking about in terms of marvelous rhythms of the play of line. But there is something else which is sort of very recent, which gives a degree of credence to this approach to art, which I find very appealing. one used to say that this fascination, modernist fascination with rhythm and harmony was characteristic of its time. And it's been succeeded by a more complex understanding of visual perception and art. But the psychiatrist and neurologist Oliver Sacks, who's written marvelous books, wrote in a fairly recent book called Musicophilia that rhythm actually plays a critical part in the way that our motor neuron system works, that actually our bodies work using rhythm to drive ourselves forward. So there's a deep biological truth in this early modernist theory, which hadn't been recognized until fairly recent neurological research. And I think that's good, because there is those of us who enjoy works of art from across the world, I think we'll often talk about rhythms and works of art, and we don't always want to say that's just an early modernist way of talking about it. Actually, there's a sense in which we feel that it's absolutely true, and we dance. One of the things that's characteristic of people, all of us dance across the world, and the one common thing we do know we have, whether we have different cultures in China or America or Britain, France, Africa, is that we're all bilaterally symmetrical. Most of us, unless we've been disabled, have 2 arms and 2 legs and 2 eyes. So we do actually have the same range of physical movements. And our understanding of bodily rhythms is actually shared across the world. And I think that's part of the attraction of this theory. So, on we go again. Now, coming to the Glazed Luohan, first of all, let's talk about a conundrum. My colleagues, a couple of whom are here, are historians, when they write about Matisse, and try to authenticate Matisse, they get very fussed about whether a painting was done in the fall of 1907 or the spring of 1908. The problem with these Luohan is that they've been dated from the early 8th century to the 15th century. That's a spread of about 500 years. That's, as Oscar Wilde, in terms of dating, might call, that's careless. So, a very serious scholar, who actually has did the analysis of the sculpture of the Barnes collection, has said that the Luohan in the Penn Museum and its fellow members of the set belong to the early 8th century because they're mentally sophisticated, they're very complex to make technically, they're very big, and they're enormously naturalistic in their handling of the features, or naturalistic within the context of Chinese sculpture. And that requires a level of sophistication which is achieved only in imperial kilns, and it was only truly achieved in the height of the Tang dynasty. Now, the height of the Tang dynasty, the big glazed models that we're familiar with, and you have some upstairs, are things like large horses, grooms, camels, all of which were made as tomb figures for the elite of the Tang capital, Chang'an, in the early 8th century. It's actually quite a short period of time. So she argues that the Penn Luohan are around about 725, all of them. So that figure on the left is a groom that would have gone with a horse of the sort we just saw. The figure on the right is a Ming Dynasty figure from the Wanli period dating to the late 16th or early 17th century. Also, these 3-colored, well, it's actually now 5-colored, the glazed ceramic piece, which technically is similar to the Luohan in its manufacture. And so it has been argued that these figures are as late as the Ming Dynasty. And so I find myself, as somebody who's interested in these figures, in a sort of slightly being embarrassed on behalf of my colleagues on Chinese sculpture, that I feel if we can't get a little matter of 500 years sorted out, we're not much good for anything. So I thought that this evening we could think about that for a moment. So here, I'll just show you the rest of the set. There are 2 wonderful pieces. They're not all in such as exemplary condition. Most of them have been broken, but some of them have lost heads. This is one of the 2 in the Met. If you go into the Asian galleries in the Met, you'll find there's a lovely room of sculpture, and these 2 sit next to each other on a plinth. And you see that they've all had rocky bases because they're all mountain-dwelling beings. And mountain-dwelling beings, the dwelling in mountains are associated with spirituality in various traditions in China. Taoism, they're associated with a particular bodhisattva, which we'll come to. And the bases are separate. This is the other figure at the Met. They're all life-size, or over. I don't know how big a Luohan is actually in actual fact. But actually, they're supposed to be like people. They're people-like. That's important. So they're sort of roughly our scale. You'll see it when you go upstairs. This is in the British Museum. They tend to be older and younger. This is in the Nelson Atkins Gallery in Kansas City. As you can see, the damage is quite severe damage. The BM ones, the Kansas City figure, the Penn figure have been nicely cleaned, respectfully cleaned. And then this is the Boston figure. This is the same figure. This is the Boston figure with its old rock head, and this is the Boston figure with its new rock head. You have to sort of think of it, it's the easier thing without the head. This is a figure which I'm afraid that's the best image we have at the moment. This is in the Seibu Saison Museum in Japan, also where you can see it's got an 8 head. And this is an interesting figure. This was a famous figure. It was well known in the German art market. It went to the Berlin State Museums, and it was believed to have been blown up during the Second World War. In fact, the literature, until fairly recently, has talked about it being destroyed in Berlin during the bombings, and my friend Stanley Abe has just let me know that it's recently been found in the storerooms of the Hermitage Museum. And I think it's unlikely it will go back to Berlin, but that's another topic which Brian and I are interested in different ways. This is the Royal Ontario Museum figure, again with a bad head. But interesting, it shows the base. Now this gives you some idea of the complexity. These are big pieces of clay. It's actually, they're earthenware, they're not stoneware, so it's still in the tradition of relatively low fire. It's not porcelainous, but big lumps of clay. And to stabilize this, to stop it collapsing in the kiln, unusually, these figures had iron rods placed inside them. And in the Royal Ontario one, 3 of the rods were burnt away, and traces of 2 of the rods had survived from the firing. So there you can see the traces there. And this is the conservation report. This is, again, it's the Met figure. It's not another one. Just a comparison. This is an interesting figure. This is in the Guillemets in Paris. And it's the only one of the set which doesn't look like the rest. It sort of looks like it and doesn't look like it. I've not seen it, so I'm keen to go and see it. But the proportions on the shoulders seem slightly different. Maybe it's just the photograph. I always used to say, when we were showing things at the British Museum, don't believe the photograph, see the thing in the flesh. So I have to see it in the flesh. But you've now seen the set, and you'll see that the robes are all the same. They have different detailing, but they're all the same. They're either solid colours, or they've got complex details, bandings and strappings, which obviously reflect contemporary textiles, and strips of silk which were used with monastic robes. This one has stippling all over, and it's just odd. So I'm not entirely sure that I find it sits readily with the others, but we'll keep it in there for the time being. This is the base of the Penn Museum image. This is the bottom of the real base, the rocky base, showing the firing holes. You really have to think very carefully about how you made one of these things, or 8 of them, or 16, actually 16 of them almost certainly, because if you didn't do it right, they'd explode in the kilns. And this is where they were found, one of the caves where they were found. They were found in a cave in Yixian, and I'm going to show you a map, in about 100 miles southwest of Beijing in the 1920s. And they were brought down by the agents. You could call them looters, you could call them dealers, you can call them people looking to try and earn $1 at a time of great uncertainty and hardship in China. 3 of them, it is recorded that 3 of these great pieces were destroyed, being carried down from the caves. And the local magistrate impounded these people and the shards. And so one had the German dealer who eventually discovered that photographed this cave had to pretend that he was sick and visiting a Lamist monastery when he was actually scouting out trying to find them, obviously seeing if there are any more. So, the general opinion, and I'm going to steer away from the extremes. Think of this as a sort of sine wave. I'm steering away from the extremes on these figures. I don't think that they're Tang dynasty. I really don't. And I don't think that they're Ming dynasty. I think they belong in the period that I've chosen to title my talk, which is 10th and 12th centuries, and it's simply moving the pendulum more precisely to try and get the right place. Now, if we go to the 10th century, we find that China was an interesting state. For most of the 10th century, it was divided into small states. And then at the end, towards the end of the 10th century, it became two significant empires. The Liao dynasty, which was a foreign dynasty, the Qidan peoples who had come down from the north, and the Sung dynasty in the south, the northern Sung. And the Sung occupied most of what we now think of as China. The Liao were right up into Manchuria and Mongolia, and their southern capital, which was Beijing, which was constructed as southern capital there, at the time that Beijing becomes a city, was right on the southern borders. Korea is over here, Japan is here. So traditionally, I'd say traditionally, when you look at these on the internet, in museum catalogues, you'll find them called, for the most part, you'll find them called Liao dynasty. So you can see that's from the early 10th century to the early 12th century. And because the caves in which they were found were just north of the northern Song border. They fall within Liao territory. And there's one good scholar of Liao sculpture who gets very ratty with other people like me, when it's suggested they may not be Liao dynasty because she hasn't attacked me, but she's attacked another person for suggesting that they don't belong to the Liao dynasty, or the assumption that this is denigrating the Liao peoples who actually had a significant culture of their own. Well, they did actually. They had a very rich culture in the Liao period, but it was about 750,000 people controlling northern China, with about a total population there of about 4 million. So they were in the minority. And these, I think there's no, from my point of view, well, again, I talk about this, these were made in Chinese kilns by Chinese artisans. They may be made under the Liao, but they were made by Chinese. So just before that split between the Liao and the Northern Song, talk about what sort of Buddhist sculpture there was. This is an extraordinary piece. Again, I haven't seen it in the flesh, but or the bronze. It's a bronze piece. It's 22 meters high, which is about another story on top of the Barnes Foundation as it's being built. Huge. It's a 1,000-eyed, 1,000-armed Bodhisattva Guanyin, the Bodhisattva of compassion and salvation. But the arms have almost all been replaced by wooden arms. It's dated to the Northern Tang dynasty, the mid-10th century. And I put it here because one of the key things at the time, and this is true entirely true of Western European culture. I mean, maybe it's not so obvious in America, but entirely true of Western European culture, to the Reformation, and certainly in continental Europe now, that pilgrimage was a feature of life. That people traveled, people who could afford to, traveled to visit important temples, important religious sites, and they particularly travelled to places where there were known to be either remarkable images like this, or relics of, particularly of the Buddha. The Buddha's relics are rather like the remains of the true cross. I mean, you could probably build a figure that big with the remains of the remains of Buddha that are claimed to be in various pagodas and stupas. So the same image is seen more commonly in this wooden figure that's in the Met. There's a wonderful, there's a nice one upstairs. There's a nice one in the Philadelphia Museum. This is North China. Either it's claimed to be Liao. I would have normally called it Northern Song. And this is from the late Northern Song period in South China. And it's ceramic as well. So we'll talk about ceramics, but I just want to talk about pilgrimage and the importance of pilgrim sites and relics. So if you go back a moment to this large Buddha, there was a celebrated image which has long since disappeared at a monastery in Henan province, which north central China. And in the late 12th century, this is what was said about that monastery. It said, in the past, from the time of around 1100, using it has a Chinese date, the abbots of this monastery successively built it up on a magnificent scale with increasing extravagance. The resident monks numbered more than 1,000, because the Bodhisattva's relics were there in the pagoda, that's the Bodhisattva Guanyin, and many miracles were wrought, every spring in the second month, people from all parts would come regardless of distance. The worshippers must have numbered tens of thousands, and they made donations according to their means. The monks of the monastery had no need to go begging to meet their annual budget. They had more than enough. So it's pretty obvious that if you have a monastery and you need to feed your monks, if you want a prosperous, it's like building a 501c3. If you want a prosperous, successful monastery, relics really help. And great, famous, celebrated images really help, and this was clearly one of them. And so the attraction of the monastic attraction and images is very important. Luohan's played a role in this because the sets of Luohans that appeared from the 10th century onwards in temples were part of the pilgrimage experience. So we've looked at these. These are, the point about this is that Chinese ceramics are made all over. I'm sure many of you have enjoyed in passing looking at Chinese ceramics in museum galleries. It was, in this period, 12th century, an industry. It was an industry in a way it didn't become an industry in Europe until the 18th century. It was a mass production industry and of a complexity which is sometimes even staggering to think about. The big kilns of South China by the 13th century were the so-called dragon kilns, were firing 20,000 pots at a time in 2-week firing cycles. And these were towns full of these kilns. So each kiln would be producing almost getting over 500,000 pots a year. And the industry was such that they were going all over China, and the potters were influencing each other. Now, one of the critics of the theory that the Luohan might have been made somewhere else said that they really should have been made locally because they're really big things to carry. Now, Brian, Stephen Lang, myself, curators know that actually picking up a large pottery, life-size figure, putting it onto a truck and moving it is a big deal. But that's not actually, I mean, you had to move ceramics a bit like that, but that's not how ceramics were moved in China. It's not how most things were moved in China. China's trade, and by the medieval time, it had a huge trade. Paper currency was introduced at this time. A trade right across, even between the Liao and the northern Song there was trade, happened by river and canal. You didn't move things by road if you had to. Things moved in bulk on the river system. China is a riverine culture, and a very sophisticated one. So ceramics like this could move very easily from one place to another. So let's go back and look at Luohans for a bit and try and place those. So here, we're going all the way back to the late 6th century. These are the two early disciples, the young one, Ananda, Kasyapa, the older one, in a cave in Dunhuang in northwest China, brilliantly preserved. Getty Trust is doing a huge amount of work on these caves. In the early days, you really just had two figures, but then they started growing. Here are Dunhuang caves, the later caves from the 8th and 9th centuries, showing Ananda, the young monk, and the older monk, Kasyapa. When you look at the sophisticated modelling of the Penn Luohan and the others, you can understand why Angela Howard said that they were made in the Tang dynasty in the early 8th century, because there was a degree of sophistication in these faces already, which has a naturalism and an element of portraiture, which is quite remarkable. And one of the characteristics of these Buddhist cave temples is they would have the sculpture against the painting on the wall behind. So it really was a three-dimensional tableau. This on the left is the chief abbot in the mid-9th century of Dunhuang, Honglian, and an image of a monk or a Luohan seated from the 9th or 10th centuries. It's hard to tell Luohans from monks or abbots, and that's deliberate, because part of the attraction of the Luohan is they looked like the monastic community, and it was a way of making the monastic community, giving them supernatural powers, giving them a presence which was compelling, whilst recognizing that they were also people. So it's fascinating when you look at this, remarkable. This is stucco. It's not fired clay, it's unfired, painted unfired clay. And here, so I don't know whether this is not titled. I don't know whether this is an abbot, whether it's a portrait, or whether it's an image of a Luohan, because there's no attribute to give that away. But you can see the crossover between them. So again, here's one of these 8th and 9th century, early 9th century sculptures from Dunhuang, and a figure which is in the Nelson Atkins gallery of a Luohan, which is datable to some time within this period we're talking about. Now, the one thing I think does happen, and it's one of these art historical points you can argue about, is there is indeed more of an element of portraiture coming into the figures than exists in the caves at Dunhuang, where images are slightly more a generic elderly person or generic younger person. You see it marvelously in Japan in Kamakura sculpture, and but it's sometimes we can convince ourselves that something is very portrait-like when it's actually quite generic. So this is this fantastic figure from the late 10th century of the 7th century Chan patriarch Huineng. I don't know if any of you like Zen Buddhism, Zen Buddhist texts, but Huineng was the man who was responsible for that marvelous comment about minds and mirrors when he was just a modest monk in a temple, and the abbot's seat became vacant, and the famous head monk, the natural successor, said, the mind is like a mirror, you should polish it, and in that way liberation will come. And then the next day a piece of poem was written up, or koan was written, a poem written up in the temple and just tacked to a wall, and it said, the mind is not a mirror, there is no mind, there is no mirror. Everything was there, everything will always be. And it was Huineng, and he was given the abbot's position and became one of the great patriarchs of Zen. But this is an extraordinary bronze sculpture from the late 10th century. But obviously it's slightly generic. I mean, nobody knew what Huineng actually looked like. And here's a figure from the late 12th century in the Brundage collection, dated 1180. So just come back to say that this material, and it's early in my career I said Chinese sculpture was a traditional tradition, which I thought was a very cute line. Because things don't change as rapidly as they do in the early 20th century modernism. You don't get sort of from blue period, rose period, cubism, boom, 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 it's all different. There's a lot of continuity, and it's really hard sometimes for us to work out what date things are. So this is to give you a sense of what how the Luohan in Penn would have been. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that there were 16 of them. There were more than 8. You can have 8. There were more than 8. Marilyn Gridley, the Liao scholar, very convincingly argued that there were 8 until the 9th one turned up. So I think and then we could take into account the 3 which were broken. I think we have to say there were probably 16. And we have 9 clear survivors with a hermitage head, possibly the one in the Gimei, and then others which are lost. This is from a temple in Shandong from the 11th century. It's been massively restored. This is not what they look like sculpturally this is what they look like in the 11th century, but all the painting is 19th or early 20th century. And these sort of very strident blues. You have to try and think of the figures underneath. But they sat round on a platform around the hall with central Buddhas, or central Bodhisattvas, almost certainly central Buddhas, and sometimes big figures of Guanyin. Here's one from that set, and here's one. These are dated to the mid-11th century. This is 1060s. This is dated to around 1080 from a temple in Shanxi. And again, it's been repainted, not as dramatically as this one, but still, the colours are utterly different from what they would have been 1,000 years ago. But you get a sense of that modelling, and you can relate it to the Penn group. Now, there's also painted paintings. It's not all sculptural. We can get clues. As art historians, we take clues wherever we can. So a famous painting in the National Palace Museum, Taiwan, called The Long Roll of Buddhist Images from the 1170s, is coloured like this. But the image I'm actually interested in is amongst the many images are these pictures of Luohan, which show the canonical Luohan sitting on their rocks in the way that they're shown in these famous Penn group in meditation. And you're seeing a modelling which is seeking to represent each of these Luohan individually, to differentiate the set. So you can argue that's the case with the set in the great Yixian set in the Penn Museum. Certainly they just sort of divide into young monks and older monks. But there is an element where they're all being distinguished from each other. And if you go back to this set, you can see that the sculptor is actually trying to do this. Now, sculpture in China is not a high art, it wasn't a high art. Nobody recorded the name of sculptors. It was not like Western sculpture. It was an artisan tradition. It was on the same level as architecture, which was also a craft tradition. Same as ceramics. It was, nobody really wrote about sculptures. Sculpture wasn't seen as high art. Painting, calligraphy was. So, and then painting and calligraphy was divided into artisan painting and high literati painting. This is a remarkable set. There are 100 paintings of 5 Luohan each, 500 Luohan. They're in the Daitokuchi in Japan, in Kyoto. And 12 of them are, 10 of them are in, 12 of them are in Boston, and 2 of them are in the Freer Gallery. This is one of the paintings from Boston, and it shows, well, I'm trying to give you a sense of the way in which these Luohans would have been seen in a natural context. You could have had a hall of sculptures, you could have had a hall of paintings, you possibly could have had a hall of both. That would have been really quite dramatic. And here's, that's from another painting with a Luohan with a serpent protector alongside him. So, coming back to what these things are. The Liao, I'm almost tempted to call the Liao camp. Those who think that these are made under the Liao in the 10th to 12th century, in that far north China, were heartened by the discovery in the 1980s of 3 figures from a kiln near Beijing. And the kiln wasn't very well excavated. It was done, it wasn't looted, it was just done in a hurry. They weren't funds to do it properly. But these 3 figures, which were half or a third of the size of the great Luohan set, came out of these 3 coloured glazed. They're called sansai, 3 colours, or they're called liuli, which is architectural glazing. And the argument then was that these 3 figures were clear proof that the Luohan set, the famous Luohan set, was made near Beijing, that the caves that it was found in, which were also near Beijing, entirely appropriate. They were close to each other. It was effectively done, and in fact, art historical relationship between the figure on the left and the figure on the left there, with sculptures which were known to be Liao, like this one, which is in the Met, made it absolutely clear that this was Liao material. And indeed, there were at least 2 Chinese archaeologists who said, indeed, it's obvious that's where these figures' great set comes from. The Liao, this is not unique to the Liao dynasty. It's just said that Liao continued Tang traditions, and this is an absolutely remarkable figure. It's a reliquary, it's a silver and gold reliquary which was excavated from the base of the Farmansa Pagoda in Xi'an, the old Tang capital, and it was given by the emperor to the monks of that temple in 871. But you see the crown is similar here. So the argument goes, clear Liao figure, facial features and robes, and relationship to other sculptures, it makes it Liao, and the pen says it's Liao. And so all made around the capital, Beijing, the southern capital, Beijing, in Liao territory. And the kiln site, which is called Longchuan, is just right, it's actually a suburb of Beijing, and it's still a suburb of Beijing. So, on the other hand, it's actually, I'm going to show it to you here, it's kiln number 39. Right up there. So actually, here's the full map of China. You can see where the action we're talking about today, our story is all focused around here. And that little ceramic, the green glazed ceramic figure that I showed you earlier came from down there. So here's a piece of 3-coloured glazed Liao ceramics. The kiln that they identified was famous for was actually historically known for its whiteware, and indeed sherds which were excavated, white Liao, whether it was from that kiln or not, we're not sure, but it's the sort of ware that we think was made in that kiln. But the sherds that were found in that kiln were bowls like this in particular, and it's argued that these are 10th century because the kiln was known to operate by the early 10th century. But we don't know that 3-coloured glazes were made in the early 10th century. I'm going to give, so the question was, are these figures early 10th century? And I'm going to give our Liao group the benefit of the doubt, say they are. I'm not going to argue with them. We can do other things. So that's all right. Personally, I'm not convinced they're not a bit later, but let's call them 10th century for the time being. And here's the knee of the Penn Museum figure with its. This is really actually they call them 3-color glazes. This is really a 4-color glaze because there's 2 versions, white and buff. So if it was made, if these big Penn figures were made in that kiln, what might they have been made for? Well, one possibility is a great temple nearby. This is a very expensive set. You don't, at a time when small bowls, inkstands and so forth being made, the amount of money to make a set like this, although it's pottery and it's not bronze and it's not gold and it's not stone, is still huge in terms of kiln time. They need to be fired twice before the lead glazing and after the lead glazing and before the lead glazing. So we're looking, I think, for a significant temple to accommodate them. And it might have been a temple like the Transitional, which is a temple which is still thriving in the western hills of Beijing. I've been there many years ago. It's a very handsome temple up in the hills. And this is just an image of it today. It could have been something like the Transitional, we simply don't know. There was a great deal of excitement for a while around these images because there's an old inscription in the cave that said it was made for the Dragon Gate Temple is an old temple. It is the most sacred and rarefied temple. And so there was a sort of sense of, let's find the Dragon Gate Temple. If we can find the Dragon Gate Temple, we'll know where they were made for. And then recently, Chinese archaeologists have, instead of studying text, epigraphers, realized that the local temple near the cave where they were found, which was also known as Ermei Temple, was actually in the 18th century renamed Dragon Gate Temple. So it's the temple right next to the caves where they were found, which was this mythical Dragon Gate Temple. So we're looking for somewhere which is not that temple. We're looking for a significant temple. And so, so then we start thinking about 3-colored glazes. 3-colored glazes were made not just in the Liao period, in Liao, China, in the north. They were made all over North China. And one of the places that were made for, one of the things they were made for, pagodas. And there's a grand mid-11th century pagoda at Kaifeng, the northern Song capital in the middle of North China, which still stands, and it's completely clad with these tiles, these 3-colored glazed tiles. And this one's in the British Museum. And so, and again, I want to talk about where those tiles might have been made. And then there's this pot. This is a censer, which is 3-colored glazes with peonies around the sides, which was not made in North China. It was actually made in the same place as the most famous ceramic ware in Chinese history was made, which was the legendary ruware, made for the Northern Song Emperor at the end of the 11th, 13th, 12th century. There are only literally dozens of pieces of this survive. But a few years ago, the kiln site, which had been sought for a century, was discovered, and it's actually in Baofeng, and this was excavated from that site. The piece I just showed you was excavated from Baofeng. So it turns out that the site that made the most, which had the best potters in China, arguably ever, was also made these extraordinary objects, which are all national treasures wherever they are, was also making this 3-colored ware, this more domestic, ordinary architectural ware. And that, now we come to, we've been up in the Beijing area, and so after the Northern Song fell, in the early 12th century, China was still divided into 2, again with invaders. They were now the Jin dynasty, who occupied the north, and the Song Empire was pushed down south below the Yellow River. In fact, they were pushed right down below the Huai River. So this is the southern Song down here. But there was trade between the 2 countries when they weren't at war. And the area we're now looking at is near Kaifeng, right in central China, near the old Northern Song capital. And here's some kiln sites. So we were looking at a kiln site up here. We're now looking at a kiln site the kiln site that made those extraordinary blue pots is here, but it also made the 3-colored ware. And the pagoda that these tiles were made for was here. That was the northern Song capital. And it continued to be an important city. I mean, huge city. One doesn't underestimate medieval China. I mean, the population of Kaifeng in the 11th century was over 1 million people. So, I mean, the population of London was about 4 people and a dog at the time. So, now, I'll get back and look at I'll just get back to that slide. There's another important kiln site, which is just around here. And that also produced 3-coloured wares. And this was excavated in that site. It's called Guantai. And there was a type of ceramics which are, we know as Suzhou. They're black and white. They're 3-coloured wares. They're made in vast quantities. They're called people's ware, but they were made at a very high standard as well. And they were literally made in the million. And the biggest kiln site for producing these was indeed near the city of Handan at the Guantai kiln site, which has been massively excavated. And this Apsara figure, which is a Buddhist, it's a bit like an angel figure, was found in that site, together with huge numbers of molds, mass production. I mean, this is a mass production industry. And roof tiles, if anybody's been to China, you know that the tiles on the roofs of pagodas and temples and palaces, the tile is curved and often glazed. But it was also the site which produced some of the finest Song pottery that we know. It was a site that almost certainly produced the great green glazed bottle in the British Museum. It's a site that we know almost certainly produced this dragon vase in the Nelson Atkins gallery. The sophistication of the potters at Guantai was unbelievable. And it was the site that produced, this is one of my British Museum. Used to look after this pot. Lovely. These are pillows. People say, are they for the living or the dead? Well, and then we would say, well, we don't know. But I think the answer is that there was much, because there's still no conclusive proof, but I think largely, given how many there were, as much for the living. But then you shouldn't think of them as pillows as such, you should think of them as pillow supports. You would put a padded silk cushion in them. And one day I'm going to have a wooden model made, and I'm going to put a padded silk cushion in it, see what good night's sleep I get. And it also produced almost certainly this, which is very handsome pillars. Again, like the British Museum one, you see this, sometimes they're called scepter-shaped pillows, and sometimes they're called cloud-shaped pillows, but they go round and they lobe in, all lobed on the base, and this is the same. You see the point at the top, the lobes around here. So with the 3-coloured glazes, with a very clear division between the glazing, very massively good kiln control, and the glazed eyeballs, rather like the Luohan from the Penn Museum. So I would propose that this is, if one has to choose another site for these to be made, this is the site that I would choose. And there's another reason why I choose it. This site flourished between, as the excavators, and going through they did a series of strata, and they said, and how do we divide this up? The Florowit, as they say, the time of the great flourishing of this kiln was between roughly 1150 and 1220, when the Mongols came to town. And so we can think of this pillow as the second half of the 12th century. Now, as it happens, what I didn't tell you is that as we were talking about the Tang on the one hand and the Ming on the other, is that 2 of these figures have been tested using thermoluminescence. Now, thermoluminescence is not infallible, but it's a pretty good method of testing it. It's the way you measure the radiation dosage over the years. And ceramics absorb radiation at a regular rate. And so you can work out, the reason it's good is because firing turns the clock back to 0. So as soon as something has been fired and comes out of the ground, and comes out of the kiln, the clock starts ticking and it starts absorbing radiation. And so you test it for the amount of radiation, you divide it by the average amount of radiation per annum, and you get a date, which is a midpoint, and then you can say plus or minus 100 years, or plus or minus 200 years. Well, the 2 figures that have been tested, the Met figure and the Pennsylvania Museum figure, both test with midpoints of 1210. The Met figure 1210 plus or minus 200 years. I or around 1200, because I'm not sure exactly which date the test, when the test was done at the Benfica. So let's say 1200 plus or minus 200 years. So that puts it squarely towards the end of the Jin dynasty, and therefore I have trouble arguing. I've had trouble with the Liao date, which is right at the beginning of this TL testing period. So the combination of the felicity of that TL test, which gives me puts me roughly in the middle of the major cycle of this kiln, which produces remarkable ceramics on a big scale in massive quantities, makes me think that this is a good other place. I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying that this is another place we should look. And if we were going to look for a place for which they were made, I would tend to look here. This is a temple which was, the wooden halls of which were destroyed in the 1950s. The pagoda survives from the 11th century, and it stands at the foot of Drum Mountain, which is where the Xiangtanshan, which is very near, that's where the great figures that are now in the Freer Gallery come from. So there is, I quite like the felicity that if it was for this temple, for example, the Rotunda would bring together old friends. But why should it be this temple? Well, it was, first of all, Xiangtanshan was a very important site. It had cave temples going back to the 6th century. It was celebrated across China, and this temple, the Changde Se here, was built in the Tang, but it was renovated in the northern Song. Sorry, no, it was built in the northern Song, renovated in the Jin, and the year in which it was renovated was 1159. And we know that it had a Luohan hall. And so this is sitting just around where, yeah. So that's a sort of, I would put that out as an alternative place for the Luohans for a commissioning site for the Luohans. So now I'm going to sort of wrap up by talking about life of images. My Stan Abe and I share an interest in a group of sculptures from also near Beijing, which are in the West Norway Museum of Applied Art, and they're here. And I dated them to the 1160s too. And in dating them, I referred back to this temple, which also had a huge suite of stone sculptures made in 1159 when the temple was restored. So the temple inscriptions indicate there was a massive amount of rebuilding and image making in 1159. One of the reasons why that happened is because the Song, the Jin dynasty, had decided, the then emperor had decided in 1159 to go to war with the southern Song. And at this time, one of the ways, you might be surprised, but it was naval warfare, and they would battle each other on the major rivers of China. And the southern Song would defend themselves on... The southern Song were actually a naval empire. They had sea-going fleets. The Jin dynasty, originally, the Jin themselves, who were, this time, something like 4 million people ruling over a Chinese empire of 50 million, were drawing on Chinese expertise to create boats. And the first major naval battle actually happened in 1163 on the Yangtze, and using rocket and artillery fire. And basically the Song fleet blew the Jin out of the water. But to raise money for that, what in effect was rather a futile battle, the Jin emperor allowed people to build, gave them licenses to build temples. So there's a fair amount of temple building going on at that time. And it's not an accident, by the way, I think, that the first synagogue in China was built in 1163 under those conditions in Kaifeng. So, so the life of images. We've talked about pilgrimages, but for the believer, getting to be into a temple is one thing. The way that, and this is true, I think, for salvation religions in general, if I may use the term, Buddhism, Christianity, and we're going to look at Catholicism in particular, it's more than just making images. It's actually, you need to believe in the images. You need to animate the images, because this is about reciprocity. This is about exchange, that for prayers and devotion, you hope that your life will go better. In the case of China, you were looking for fertility, for prosperity, for promotion, for good harvests, and offerings were made to the monks and to the temples. And the more luxuriant the temples were, the more attractive they'd become. So that was the great cave 45 in Dunhuang there, late 8th, 9th century cave. We saw one of the images from that before. Extraordinary caves. This is a Liao temple in 11th century temple. Great tableau with Buddha and the surrounding attendants. Here's the figures we saw before, and this was Union Station yesterday. So the figures, I can't resist these. These figures at the top were carved by Louis St. Gaudens, who was the brother of the much more famous St. Gaudens, and they're Roman centurions. But I was looking at them thinking they were very much like my photograph of the Luohan in Shandong. But we know in our minds when we want to make images real and when we want them to be commemorative like this, or significant in other ways, or just grand, or to wow people. When these really wow you, I mean they're great pieces of monumental sculpture, but I didn't see anybody kowtowing. I saw nobody needing offerings or burning incense in front of them. When we moved to Catholic saints, these are two images by Donatello from the early 15th century in Florence, in the Or Saint Michel. St. George and St. Mark so that's the slightly earlier one. And by Sebastiano Torrigiano for St. Peter's in the late 16th century of St. Peter and St. Paul. You knew when an image could be animated, and you knew when it was just merely a decorative image. And why was it? I mean, one of the keys to this story is what is it that triggers difference? Why is it that you make offerings to some and you bring them alive and you expect reciprocity and not to others? The answer, I think, lies in the story. That we are storytelling creatures, that we live by stories. We theatre, religious sagas, religious narrative, stories of Buddhist divinities, of Catholic saints, animated for us, and they're part of our culture. And we need the characters in the stories to be real if we expect anything from them. So if we want to supplicate to a Buddhist Luohan and expect to get a good harvest, or if I'm a woman and I want children and I can't have a male child, if I want something, I have to bring them to life. And there's a marvelous quote by a 12th century Buddhist monk who talks about the way he says, the images are not the seat of the god, but the people believe they are. You need, whether you can call it belief, you need to animate the character in the story to make it real for you, which is why some images work for some people, but not all images work for everyone. Why some people can look at these and say they're Hobbesian empty bottles, and others will look at them and say they're Luohan, and if I burn incense to them and if I make offerings to them, they will actually do what I want them to do. And it's the story that you bring. It's the story in which you place the Luohan, which you will know if you're part of that religious community, which those who are not part of the religious community won't. And as we see these images in museums, and we often think about vitality, I can conclude by saying the vitality and the life that Barnes saw in his sculpture, and that Lawrence Binion or Oswald Saran saw in the sculpture that they bought, this sense of rhythm and vitality, that formal sense of life, that bodily sense of life, is different from the life that a believer brings, which is an animated character in the story of which you are part. These are supernatural characters in the world in which you play a role as well. In religious life, the gap between the supernatural, the religious, and the mundane is not large. It's a thin veil. And the gods, the saints, the bodhisattvas are part of your world. They have to be if you want something from them. Because if you make them dead, you're not going to get anything. So this is about animation, and it's a different form of life. So with that, I'd like to thank you for putting up with me, and I say I will go up to the Rotunda, and if there are any questions before we go up, I'm happy to take them. Thank you. mudras, which are power. These are hand gestures used for both in meditation and in Buddhist sculpture. They're all meaningful. There's a whole canon of Buddhist hand gestures. But some of them, like when they're just gripping the robes, simply they're just holding the robe. So in this case of these two, the left hand is, well actually that's not entirely true. I think, actually that may, is the left hand in your figure holding something? That may not be a mudra, it may be holding something. But the others are mudras, but these are just holding the robes. He's holding a scroll. Maybe we should go backwards, but yes, hand gestures in Buddhist art are deeply meaningful. And you can decipher them. They're actually textbooks you can look at and say, things like compassion or generosity. They actually send a signal of what the Buddha or Bodhisattva is telling you that they're doing.
Could you say something about the ears? The size
Yes.
of the ears?
The long ears originally come from the Bodhisattva figures. Bodhisattvas were really different from Buddha figures, although in many ways the belief of their powers were similar. But they were princely, they were attendants. The Buddhas were showed as ascetics. The Bodhisattva were always shown as princely figures, princely attendant figures, and covered with jewelry. And the long ears come from the fact that they were believed to have very heavy earrings on their ears, which pulled down the ears. So the long ears eventually became a symbol of enlightenment, of profound divinity. And it transferred onto the Luohan figures as just a straightforward transfer of iconography.
Was there anything about the long ears with the longevity?
I don't think so. No. I think the longevity. I mean, this is. I don't believe so. I think it's merely a princely attribute.
Yes. Why are the Luohans and Bodhisattvas? What is the difference? I know a Bodhisattva has attained nirvana and is now compassionate enough to be among us mortals. But what is the difference between a Luohan and a Bodhisattva? And also, are the statues themselves venerated as they are divine, or are they a representation of the divine? Or
I think, by and large, for the believer, they're represented, to answer your last question, as divine. They are all the large numbers of Luohan are particularly East Asian development. In the powers they're believed to have, they're not much different from bodhisattvas, and they're really an additional stratum to divinities, particularly protective divinities. And in terms of, if you think of what they actually did functionally for you, they did the same sorts of things that the bodhisattvas did. That is, you supplicated them, you exchanged what your end, whether it was a sacrifice or burning incense or giving money, paper money, paying money to the temple, earning merit, and they in return would look after you in ways that you hoped. So you could ask a Luohan or a Luohan set for the same sort of things you would ask for a bodhisattva. Often the case, they are associated because of particular nature of Chinese Zen Buddhism with the bodhisattva Guanyin. So it was a generalized group to which you would offer hope. I would say reciprocity is what it was about. And so as long as you think of you giving something, getting something back, is sort of the general idea. And that includes power. Now, the one thing about the Luohan, which is, I think is why they were really important in China, and it's a sort of slightly different reason. For most of its history in China, Buddhism was fighting with the state, and it was fighting with Confucian, the Confucian court. This became very intense in the 10th century, the period we're talking about, when there was a Confucian revival, and huge attacks on Buddhist ideology. And in fact, is when Confucianism really took off as an ideology to rival Buddhism in its intellectual compulsion. So the Buddhists, and particularly in this period, I mean the late 9th, 10th century, after the great persecution of 845, they find ways to fight back and to make Buddhism assimilate and accommodate Confucianism. And one of the ways to do it is to use Chinese figures who look like regular monks as saintly figures. So they're transitional between the Buddhist realm and the native Chinese world in a way that the Indianized bodhisattvas can't be.
Right, thanks.
So would you compare, after like would you know like 845,
Persecution.
the Great Persecution?
Yeah.
So would you compare this progression of Buddhist art to maybe like a counter-reformation, like making Buddhist ideas more accessible to the people so that it makes more of a comeback? So could you compare that in a way to the counter-reformation in Europe?
I've never heard that. I've never heard.
Because like,
Yeah.
well, when you showed the Donatello
Yeah.
from Orsami Kele, like it made me, and the exchange of ideas and being able to express those ideas and make people connect. From my understanding, Buddhism wasn't talking about what's happening here and now, and that's why people played Confucius.
Right.
Because he was talking about what he sees. So by comparing this to counter-reformation, for me, it kind of makes me understand more of a social.
Right. I think that's a wonderful comparison. I've never seen it written down, so you can claim it. There is a whole different mood. Some things going on in this late medieval period, which I don't know whether they map onto Counter-Reformation truly, but consistent with where you're going. One is it's actually expanded. The community, the Buddhist community expands. It becomes more syncretic. That there's a beginnings of a movement to absorb Taoism and Confucianism into it, which will accommodate it better to native climes. But within the traditional schools of Buddhism, there is absolutely a need to bring in money. I mean, it's always true for monasteries. And there are periods when the temples cease to be tax exempt, which they were under the time. And one of the problems that Buddhism got attacked periodically is periodically it would become tax exempt, and then periodically temples would be attacked for being tax exempt. So lay communities were really important. So when you talk about reaching out, the thing that Buddhist monasteries and temples could do best for the ordinary folk were masses for the dead, because it was still believed that this was also part of the success. I mean, one of the successes of Buddhism, this is the cunning of ideology, is you promoted the idea of hell. Now, if you promote the idea of hell, you also, never, as managers say, never offer me a problem without a solution. So the answer to hell was the Buddhist paradises, which they also could offer. And they would also offer to the laity clearly a very compelling way of dealing with the dead that traditional Confucian mourning rites didn't do nearly as well. So huge amounts of money came in through Buddhist masses. It definitely became a more popular religion. I think it's fascinating for all of us to think about mapping this onto the Counter-Reformation. So thank you. Okay, well,
if there are no additional questions, then we invite you all to the Chinese Rotunda on the 3rd floor of the museum, where our speaker will take you directly to the Luohan and clarify it in even more detail. But before we do that, let's give him another round of applause.